Thanks for coming, everyone. This morning we'll look at what are the new features in YAWL for the 2.2 release, or the things that have changed or been added to since 2.1. These are the major topics that will be covered today. And they're the biggest things, they're the biggest changes in 2.2. So the addition of non-human resources, talk a bit about what secondary resources are, look at the new calendar subservice, the scheduling service, and a few other things at the end. So in 2.0, as you know, the resource service was introduced, and with that came support for all of the resource patterns for human resources. But the missing piece of the puzzle was the non-human resources, so all of the other things that are required to complete a task that you might need that aren't necessarily human. For example, a room, or machinery, raw materials, any other resource, organisational resource that you need that you need to complete a task. And so now they have been added to the resource service, and you can choose the non-human resources you want to apply to a task at design time in the editor, and they are allocated when the task enters execution or starts executing. So all of the resources that are booked at design time are allocated at runtime when the task starts, and when it completes, then they're released. And non-human resources can be grouped into categories or subcategories. So as a visual idea of what's going on, we have a set of non-human resources, and we've got two categories, rooms and office machinery, office machines, and within each one there's subcategories. So for example, in office machines you've got three categories, but all of those non-human resources also belong to the category office machines. You can see in rooms there's a conference room that is not in any subcategory. Some things don't belong to a subcategory logically. In this case, if you've only one conference room in the organisation, not much point in putting it in its own subcategory. So resources don't have to be subcategorised, but they can be. And naturally, because we've added those non-human resources, we need to have some way of administrating the addition and subtraction and modification of those things. So there's a couple of new screens in the admin pages. Looks very similar to the org data admin page. In fact, it's based on the same structure. So you've got all your resources on the left, description of each one, if you like, and what category and subcategory they belong to. And you can add new ones there. You can change their categorisation and so on. And then on the categories tab of the same page, you can see that there are three sets of categories at the moment. And down here you can drop down the list and you can see all of the members of that category that's currently selected. And over here you can add and subtract any subcategories. You can see there's a subcategory called None there. That is a special subcategory for those non-human resources that don't belong logically to any other category. So every non-human category has a None subcategory. So for example, that conference room would be put into that None even though it was not physically done and not physically put in there. The system puts it in there because it doesn't belong to any other. Okay, so we now have two different sorts of resources, which can be neatly divided into human resources and non-human resources. But there is another way of looking at resources, and that's to split them into a primary resource and a number of secondary resources. Now, simply because a non-human resource doesn't have a work list, there's no sense in having, or no sense in trying to provide a work list for non-human resources. But every work item that's acted on by a participant or a user, a human, needs a work list. So that primary resource is the participant whose work list the work item will show up on. Secondary resources can be a mix of human and non-human resources that are required to complete the task. So again, a primary resource is simply the participant who receives the item on their work list, whereas a secondary resource is a set of 0 or more resources, whether they're human or non-human, that are also required to complete the task and therefore assigned to the work item at design time. So if you're a human secondary resource, you never see the work item on your work list. Only the primary resource sees that. Non-human resources don't have a work list at all. Any participant or any human resource may be the primary resource for some work items and the secondary resource for others. And of course, because of the work list limitation, you can never have a non-human resource as a primary resource. So all work items can have a primary and 0 or more secondary resources. In the editor at design time, there's a new screen added to the resource wizard where you can allocate secondary resources. On the left-hand pane there, you can see a list of all of the available participants and all of the available roles, and non-human resources, which I've called assets there to save space. I'll explain more about why I chose that name later. But all of the individual non-human resources and all of the categories and subcategories. And simply by clicking on any of those, it'll move that selection to this set of selected resources. You can see over here we've got some individual participants chosen, we've got some roles chosen, and we've got some non-human categories and a non-human resource, an operating theatre in this case. Note also that we've got 2 surgical nurses listed there because we want 2 surgical nurses for the task. So roles and categories can be chosen more than once. Whereas individual participants or individual assets can only be chosen once because they're unique entities. So you do that at design time. You can add and remove things from there in the editor. So at runtime, when a work item started, any of its secondary resources that are allocated are marked as busy. And by marked as busy, that just means it writes a record to the process log of the resource service to say that participant, or sorry, that resource is busy. Any roles and categories, of course, are resolved into individual assets or participants at that time. When the work item is then completed or cancelled, then those busy secondary resources are released by writing another record to the process log to say that individual resource is released. So what happens at runtime if we've got a set of secondary resources chosen that aren't available when the work item starts for one reason or another? Well, firstly, what does happen can be configured. So we can choose to either allow the work item to start anyway without its full set of chosen secondary resources, or we can set this value to true in the web XML of the resource service, and that will prevent a work item from starting if all of its secondary resources are not available for one reason or another. So whether you choose to block or not block, and a secondary resource is unavailable at runtime, both of those options will trigger a resource unavailable event in the resource service, which goes out to any other services that are listening to those events. Both of those choices will also write a message to the log, but if you've chosen to block, then the work item will not be started. Rather, it will be placed on the participant who tried to start the work item on their allocated work queue. So, how do you resolve such an issue? Well, the easy way is to just let it sit there for a while and try again a bit later, and hopefully, cross fingers, the resource will be available at that time. Or the administrator can actually go in through the admin queues, choose the work item in question, and modify its set of secondary resources. Now, those changes that are made will only apply to the work item that's selected. So basically, at runtime, the resource service gets a template of secondary resources for all work items of that particular task. But particular work items can be overridden. So here you've got a screen similar to the one in the editor. So you've got all your participants, your roles, your assets, your categories, and you can move into or remove selected items from there. Each time you select something, you can check to see if that set is available. And eventually, by moving items in and out, you might get to a point where when you check, you'll be told that all the resources are, all that set of resources are available. If you then go and save that set, then that is a set of resources that will be used for that particular work item. But any other work items on that task, in another case or in later cases, will not use this set. They'll go back to the original set and try again. Note also one other small feature. The pop-up dialogues now have the OK button focused, so you can just press the Enter key to get rid of it. So, unavailable resources. So resources are unavailable whenever they're marked as busy in the process log. But there might be other times or other reasons why they might be unavailable. For example, participant might be on leave, or it might be outside work hours. Or for one reason or another, a non-human resource is unavailable. So you might have machinery under repair or whatever. So to manage those sorts of situations, a calendar service has been introduced as a sub-service of the resource service. So it maintains a calendar of availability for all resources. And an entry in the calendar means that that resource is not available at that time. Every activity on the calendar is recorded in its own log. So whether you're adding, subtracting, changing any calendar records, like everything else, it's logged. The admin screen for the calendar looks like this. You get a drop-down filter box at the top. You can leave it as unfiltered, or you can choose to be one of these 5 sets of things. All resources means it will show, actually, no, all resources, all participants, and all assets are group names for entries that affect all of that group. So, for example, a public holiday, you would add or choose all participants and make them unavailable for that day. And that means that's just a blanket choice. All resources, just is blanket across everything. So an entry for all resources means no resource is available between the start time and the end time. If you choose unfiltered on the filter, it will show all of the records, whether set to all resources or individual participants or whatever. Here we have 2 individual items, a participant and a non-human resource. You can see on the second row the participants unavailable between 9 and 11, whereas the camera, the non-human resource, is unavailable from midnight on the day that's selected, which is up the top is the 25th, until 23:59 on the 31st. So you can see there under the end date and start date, you can see where items span more than one day. Again, you can choose one of these and click Edit, and all that information will move down to the bottom. and you can change any of those features of that record and then save it. You can also add new records from here. You can see add's grayed out at the moment because we have unfiltered selected. You can only add when you choose one of these other items from the drop-down menu. So, for example, if you choose a individual participant in the filter drop-down, you'll see a list of all participants in the resource drop-down. Selecting a resource there moves their name down to the bottom, and you can add more items for that individual resource. To add a record, you enter the start time and the end time. If it spans more than one day, you can choose what date it runs to. And that will add a block. So if you choose 7 days into the future, it will add one record that spans 7 days. If you click the repeat checkbox, it will add one record for each day for the next 7 days, in between the start time and the end time. The workload is a percentage out of 100. If it's 100%, it means that resource is fully committed at that time, but you can have partial commitment of a resource. So, for example, taking the medical example, you might have a surgical nurse that can work in 2 rooms at the same time. So do a bit here and then go and do a bit there. So they might be committed for 50%, which means that they're still available for another 50% workload. Okay. Now all of that functionality comes into play when we look at the scheduling service. So what we've seen so far is pretty cool, that you can add, you can book resources, and at runtime those resources are allocated to that task and then released when the task finishes. But the real strength of the approach comes into play when we look at the scheduling service, which was developed by the Pericles organisation out of Rostock in Germany, with a bunch of partners, including us. So we worked together with them to develop this service that talks to the engine and the resource service. And they have kindly donated that service to the YAWL Foundation, or most of the service. So it will be available in YAWL 2.2. And just quickly, the architecture is as follows: the engine and the designer, the resource service here, and the new scheduling service. The scheduling service recognises different types of work items, but there's not much to the differences in them. I'll just go through them quickly. An S task or a scheduling task is simply a task that has a particular custom form allocated to it. The custom form is owned by the scheduling service. So a scheduled task comes through interface B to the resource service for resourcing in the normal fashion. And it's given to the appropriate person who's been allocated that resource, that work item. When they start that work item, they'll see the custom form that is owned by the scheduling service. And that custom form talks to the scheduling service. The scheduling service talks to the resource service to get a list of all the resources. Shows them on the form, lets the user choose what resources they need for an activity, and then enters into a communication or a conversation with the resource service, allowing the user to choose a set of resources, asks the resource service if they're available or if they can be booked. Resource service says yes or no, passes back a result, and in so doing, eventually arrives at a place where all of its resources that it wants to book are available. Says, okay, save those. The resource service marks in the calendar that those resources are booked for an activity and passes back okay, and the user then closes the form and continues. Then later on, there's other sorts of tasks here. SOU means start of utilisation. EOU means end of utilisation. when one of those tasks is enabled, it passes through interface B directly to the scheduling service. It then passes a message back to the resource service and says, remember those items I booked for this activity? Well, this activity is now starting. So please mark those resources as being busy, which it does. And it goes along one or more tasks later, it then ends activity. So you can see there's quite a lot of interplay between the resource service and the scheduling service. Now, an activity can span more than one task, and they also can be nested within each other. So it gives you quite a bit of flexible functionality. So as an example here, we've got a workflow here. There's a few S tasks to begin with, a few scheduling tasks. In the boxes here, for example, at design time, the primary resource chosen is the anaesthetist who receives this task, and then they, because it's an S task, see that custom form, and they choose some other resources, some secondary resources that will be allocated to that activity at runtime. And the same for the others. You can see up here the nurse is a primary resource, MR device is a secondary resource for that task, but they don't have to do any other booking, so that's not an S task. So on the S task, each one of those shows a custom form to that particular resource, and they choose the particular secondary resources that they need. And at runtime, you can see here there's 3 activities. That's one there. Incision to closure is one. Induction to extubation is one. So that's nested inside that one. And you've got another one of the unpacker. In between those SAU and NOU tasks, there can be any number of other tasks that are involved. So you might have 5 other tasks in there. In the incision to closure, there might be 5 tasks. But all of those resources that are booked through the S task are booked for that activity until such time as the resource service gets the EOU event from the scheduling service, or the case is cancelled or completes. And that's an example of the, or it's similar to the custom form that the users will see when they choose an S task. So you can add any number of resources here by pressing the plus button there. You get a list of things, either human or non-human, individual humans, or roles, or individual, or you can choose individual non-human things are there, or a category in a subcategory. So the user goes ahead, fills in the date and the duration required, fills out this list, tries to save it. It talks to the resource service. The resource service will either come back and say, yeah, that's fine, or it will say, well, no, there are actually there's no nurses available at that time, at that level. So then the user might need to change the level or make some other arrangements, change the time perhaps. Okay. So that's scheduling, calendar service, non-human resources. Another new feature is task documentation. So any task at design time can have some documentation set against it. So you can choose to add some documentation to a task. Any work items at runtime that are created from that task, you'll see the documentation show up in the work list. So it's a simple way to add some sort of other description of the task besides the specification name, its task name, and whatever. So just some other descriptive text. You can embed some X queries, which will be run against the net level parameters at runtime, and whatever is in that variable will be added to the documentation at runtime. And that's done when the work item is first created. You can also add annotations such as in this example. So at any time, anybody who can see that work item can annotate the documentation. And you can put neat little things in like $now or $date, $time, and it will evaluate to the current date and time. So if the admin person annotates a work item, any user that sees that work item will immediately see the documentation show up on their work list as well. And any annotation, so if nothing changes, it's not logged, but anything that's added to the documentation at runtime is recorded in process logs. So that's a neat way of annotating, making notes, descriptive text, and having message passing between administrators and other users. Okay, this one's for the developers out there, codelets. When we originally added codelets to the functionality, we imagined that codelets would only be very short run pieces of code that run for an automated task. So they might last 1 second, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. When it got out there, people started using it for longer running things. You know, for something we didn't anticipate. We thought codelets are a short running task. Anything that needs to run a long time, a custom service is the job for that. But of course, because they're so flexible, people started using them for very long running tasks. So it's been completely overhauled. Each codelet now runs in its own thread, whereas before it ran in the same thread as a resource service. So if the codelet was long running, it would actually block the resource service from doing anything else until it completed. So they each run in their own thread. They have direct access to the work item that started them, so they can use any of the data that's included in the work item. They have direct access to all of the org data and all of the process logs of the resource service. So you can write code that directly retrieves that sort of information from the resource service. Handle now, they used to only handle simple data types. They handle complex data types now. They used to persist automatically. Now you can choose to not persist them. There may be some occasions where you don't want your codelet to be persisted so that it doesn't start running again when the engine restarts. And added some new methods to give the developer more control over what happens while it is running. And these are those methods which all can be overridden or ignored as the case may be. So there is an init method when the codelet first starts and can be used to do any initialization tasks. Whenever the engine shuts down or the resource service shuts down, it will generate a shutdown event. It will call any shutdown methods in any of the codelets. And you can do anything you need to do to gracefully shut down your codelet. Resume is the opposite. When it starts up again for any codelets that were previously running and persisted, you can put any tasks in there to bring it back up from how you shut it down. And there's a cancel method that's called when the work item that was running that codelet was cancelled, or either the work item itself or the case as a whole was cancelled. And then you can write any things in there to graciously shut down or to stop your codelet. Also, as in custom services, codelets now support the get required params method, which allows you to specify what params are needed for this codelet. And when the codelet's chosen in the editor, will automatically insert the input and output params that are required to run that codelet, or the ones that that codelet expects to receive. So a lot more control for developers, and now it can handle long-running codelets. Those additions allowed me to write 2 new codelets that allow you to get the information of a person who completed a previous task. So in other words, find their name and user ID of someone who completed a task previously in that case. And then you can use those outputs, or this output as an input to this get supervisor info, and find out who that person's supervisor is. So in this example, leave request, the participant on the left makes a leave request. Auto task gets their name and user ID, and then the get supervisor info gets the ID of the supervisor of that person. This approval task has a deferred allocation based on supervisor ID, so that when that gets mapped to that net level variable from there, it then uses that as a deferred allocation for this task. It goes to the supervisor. Then when the supervisor approves or unapproves that request, it then goes back to the requester using the familiar task pattern. Both of these codelets run very, very quickly, so in under half a second, both of those run on my Mac. So the user never sees any of that going on. And the next task that happens is the approval being sent to the supervisor. So as well as providing that functionality, they're also useful examples of how you can poll the resource service directly from a codelet. Another bugbear in the old 2.1 was the fact that if you wrote any new codelets or allocators or filters or constraints, you had to insert them in the package along with the other YAWL classes. So that every time you upgraded your packages in Tomcat, you had to copy all of those out someplace, add the new system, and then copy them back in again. Now you can store them anywhere on the local disk, and then in WebXML put that path in. And that can be in several places across the disk as well. So that when, for example, in the editor, you go to the codelet selection screen, it will get codelets from all of those places on the machine that's running Tomcat and pass all of them back. So no longer do people have to copy them in and out of the YAWL packages. Logging for both the engine and the resource service can now be disabled independently. Now, if time is a crucial factor in your workflows and you're not that interested in the process logs, you can disable them. The keeping of the process logs adds maybe 40% time to execution. So if it's time critical, you can choose to turn them off in WebXML. There's been a download log button added to the case management form, so if you wanted to get a complete XES formatted log of a specification, you just choose the specification you're interested in from the set of loaded specs and click the download log button, and depending on how many cases there are against that specification, you just need to wait a few seconds and you'll have the complete log. Also, the nodes within each trace element are now ordered on timestamp. The menu bars, because of the extra screens I had to add to the web pages, actually had to split into two menu bars because this wouldn't fit across the page anymore. So an ordinary user will see the top one. An ordinary user with maybe the manage cases privileges gets that button as well. If they can see their team queues, I'll see a team queues button in there also. That's the admin one. If you're a participant with administrative privileges, you now get two menu bars, one under the other. The user one and the admin one. Simply because they couldn't fit it all across one screen. And that's really the reason why the asset name is there rather than non-human resources, because non-human resources wouldn't fit. That's the reason for that. Okay, some other things in the editor. Fix the error messaging at the bottom of all those input dialogues where you might put in X queries or XML schema. So whereas before, since version 0.1, you only ever got one line and you had to put the mouse over it to get a tooltip. Now you get, it opens up and you can read the whole thing, which is a lot more useful. Because of that, I had to resize a couple of other dialogues so you can see those messages more clearly. For people who like to work with keyboard and mouse without having to click on zoom and unzoom buttons, if you hold down the shift with the mouse wheel, you can infinitely zoom in or out. And shift control will move left or right. Oh, yeah, and file versioning. So this was an idea of Stefan's. Each file that you save, if you turn this on, and you get the option to do this at file save time, it will save individual copies of every version. So if you click 20 times and you've got that turned on, you'll find 20 versions of that file, each with a unique number at the end of the file name. So you can keep a complete history. So rather than backup, which just saves the current one when you save a new one, this keeps a complete history of every iteration of that particular process model. There's been a confirmed dialogue added to drop decomposition, so people can't drop their decompositions accidentally. We'll make sure you know what you're doing before you do that, because of course dropping a decomposition from one task also drops it from all of the other tasks that use that decomposition. You can also, on the specification menu, choose to permanently remove any dropped decompositions, because I got the message that people often want to throw out a decomposition and create a new one of the same name. You couldn't do that before. If you go to the specification menu, you'll see a spot where you can actually throw it out completely. In the analysis feedback dialog that comes up, there's now a stop button, so if it's taking a real long time and you're sick to death of the sight of it, you can click stop and it will stop. There's also line numbering and auto formatting and a little find box in the data definitions dialog. So if you've got big data schemas, you can turn line numbers on, and in the error box, the multi-line error box at the bottom, it will point to the actual line number, and you can see which line number it's talking about. And we talked about auto-populating codelet params before. Another frustration was when you accidentally closed a browser window or tab that had YAWL currently running in it, and when you reopened the tab or opened the window, it blocked you out. It said, no, you're already logged on in this browser. Log out before you can log on again. Now, if you do that and the session's still active, it will just automatically take you back to the last page you had active. So if you reopen the tab any time within the hour, you'll go back to it. Talked about the pop-up message dialogues having to focus on the OK button. If a work item has a timer associated with it, it will now show, rather than the age or how long it's been alive for, it will show how long it's got until it expires. So this is a countdown rather than an incrementing timer. So if there's a timer with a work item, on the work list it will show you how long you've got until that work item expires. And even though that text is covered up, If you choose to use the visualizer applet, you can now configure in WebXML how big that window is inside the browser. So if it's got a huge screen, you can make it bigger or smaller. It defaults to 800 by 600. It used to be that if you chose a, it used to be that on a dynamic form, if you had a date field, the minimum and maximum times were hard coded. Now, if you want to set those minimum and maximum times, you can set it via an XML schema restriction. So for that field, you can set a date field with a min exclusive or inclusive, max inclusive or exclusive, and it will set the date range for that particular field at runtime. The deferred allocation variable used to be able to store one participant or one role. You can now store any number comma separated. So you can defer allocate to 20 participants if you wish. There's a lot of work going on under the hood. Complete overhaul of persistence framework so that commits are much less frequent than they used to be. Things are more logically grouped into units of work rather than committing each and every change. It waits until the thing's complete before it commits a lot. And that on its own and a few other things means the whole shebang loads up a lot faster than it used to. It's also better when you load a specification and it checks for empty local variables, which will cause a problem at runtime. That's also improved and can handle splits and joins better than it did before. Things that developers might be interested in. Used to be the case that you could only have one listener in the engine for interface X events, and it was the worklet service exception service. Now you can have any number of, or the engine will accept any number of interface X listeners, so that when an exception event occurs in the engine, then you can have any number of services listening to those events and taking the appropriate, or doing the appropriate thing. As well as an expanded interface R to handle all those non-human resources. There's also a new interface S for scheduling, which allows you to get the list of available resources, to check whether a resource is available, to book a resource for an activity, and so on. The resource service will also accept multiple listeners for resource unavailable and calendar status change events. So any number of services can listen to see if a resource is unavailable. For example, a calendar status change event means if a service or a user has booked a resource for a time and then the administrator goes in and changes that booking, it generates an event. So that service can know that it's been changed. The required or get required params method will also now accept optional params for custom services and codelets. So they will show up in the list in the editor of things it needs, but they're optional values, and it will say that they're optional. And also I've added Hibernate statistics via interface A. So there's a method there. You can first choose from a service or a codelet to turn those statistics on, and then at some time later you can get those statistics, and it's quite a long range of different sorts of statistics you can get from the Hibernate framework to see where, or see if there's any bottlenecks or any slow parts of the code. The engine now generates a shutdown event. We saw an example of that in the codelet method. It gets called when the engine shuts down or the resource service shuts down. The engine actually sends out an event to all of its services to say, hey, I'm shutting down, do what you have to do. There may be a work item or a task allocated to a service at design time but at runtime that service is not there for one reason or another. If that happens and the engine can't pass it to the service, it will redirect it to the default work list, which is the resource service by default, so that the process doesn't just hang in that situation still. The administrator can then choose to do whatever he needs to do with that particular work item. LDAP now supports multiple bindings and filters. It used to only support one binding, so you can have multiple bindings for those organisations to do that. Some methods in the resource gateway now have JSON-P support, so that the information is passed back in JSON format. And all of the Java doc is up on your foundation org too. So as well as that, there's been a large number of bug fixes. As I said, there's a lot of work going on under the hood. If you're interested in seeing what's been fixed, look at the release notes. And basically that's all of the major things that are in 2.2, that weren't in 2.1. And there's a few more. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff under the hood. So you should find that things work a lot more efficiently than they used to. What's on the drawing board? Well, we've come to the stage where I have to do some documentation. So updating the user manuals, technical manual, that's to be done post-haste. Java doc to be completed. So I've done about half the Java docking much more neatly than it is, but you'll see it gets down to a point. If you look at the Java doc, it gets down to a point where it just starts getting messy again. So I have to complete that. Want to completely overhaul the front end of the editor, and to make the editor code sit in its own jar so that it can be easily plugged into different sorts of front ends. So have a web-based front end, desktop, text-based, whatever you need to do. Have another look at the data perspective, see if we can make things a bit easier for users. We'll look at inter-process communication, or some basic form of that in the next release. And also receiving events, external events, and handling those in the engine as well, which we don't currently do. And that's it. Thank you.